Hey everybody, welcome back to the Quest for the Bestest. It's a podcast where we're trying to figure out the best picture of all time out of all the best picture winners as chosen by the Academy. And today, there's a very important question that we are asking ourselves. To quest or not to quest? That is the question. Yeah, that's right. If you guessed it or you watched last episode, we're talking about Hamlet, directed by Laurence Olivier from 1948. It's a pretty stock standard retelling of the William Shakespeare play, but I think there's some interesting things to say about it despite all that. We got some interesting opinions. I know someone's going to come out of the gate here with some hot takes about Hamlet and with the Bard himself, but you know, we'll get to that when we get to that. But first, we have to do a little tiny bit of housekeeping. Last week, we talked about a pretty interesting film, a little bit of spookiness, some crime, some solving things. That's right, it was Silence of the Lambs, Jonathan Demme's film from 1991. And it, with a score combined of 9.1, ended up at place number 6 on our list. Way high up there, top 10. That's big numbers for a pretty dang good film. So, today, Hamlet. Let's talk about it. Abram, I know you are a Shakespeare enjoyer and you have studied Hamlet, so why don't you kick us off with maybe a little recap. You know, this doesn't really deviate that much, but at least some general thoughts and the basic plot outline of this film.
Sure. So the general plot outline, if you've gone to high school, you probably already know this, but it's about Hamlet Jr., who is kind of mopey after the death of his father, and his mother immediately remarries his father's brother. So there's a little bit of, family tension here in the state of Denmark. And we come to realize after meeting the ghost of Hamlet Sr. that actually he was poisoned and that this weird family remarriage and kind of power consolidation is a little bit more nefarious than it seems. And essentially the story is about Hamlet trying to get to the center of that, get back at his uncle and restore peace to the state of Denmark. But now Timo, I'm going to hop right in here and give my first impressions.
Go right ahead.
I wanted to go first anyway.
Yes.
And he's going to do it regardless of what any of us say.
Right, that's absolutely correct. So I'm a terrible liberal arts English major, so I'm rather familiar with my Shakespeare, and I like Shakespeare a fair amount. And I like a good Shakespeare adaptation. I think when they get a little bit wilder, they get better. So I really love, for instance, Michael Fassbender's Macbeth. That's a really tantalizing way to retell and modernize that story. But I even like a straight Shakespeare adaptation. Good old Kenneth Branagh does some really great ones. I think Henry V is particularly compelling. But why I like them is that they punch up the material and make it more accessible on screen. My problem with Laurence Olivier's Hamlet is that it is such a straight adaptation that has so many sequences of just straight dialogue that is delivered in such a quick manner that I think you lose a lot of the ability to really interpret the complexities of Shakespeare's prose, and in doing so, you kind of catch the shape of the plot, but not necessarily what makes it so interesting. And even having read Hamlet before, I went for sequences of this film picking up only the broadest strokes because I just wasn't particularly impressed by the way that visuals were used to communicate information, nor did I find a lot of the line delivery to happen at a pace where I was able to really engage with the dialogue. So while I think the production is very impressive and it is a very faithful realization of this narrative, I'm not sure if it's one that hits the marks I want out of a Hamlet adaptation.
There you go. And I think next up we're going to go across diagonally, kitty corner, to Mr. Tucker. What do you think? What do you have to say about this film? And maybe a little bit about Hamlet as a story in general.
Well, I'm going to work my damnedest to distance myself from the deep-seated vitriolic Shakespearean hatred that boils within my veins every waking hour, every minute of every day. Mm-hmm. I will work my hardest to make my comments here analytical, not necessarily reflective of the problems that I have with feeling awkward with Shakespeare as a whole, but I think why this film in particular doesn't work for me outside of the Shakespearean stuff is just that when we're going into a Best Picture, not only a Best Picture, but a movie, I want a film to use its filmic elements to increase the engagement of the material. And because this film is so faithful to that original play, although it had to cut out a significant amount to be chopped down to a breezy 2.5. No. But it doesn't really feel like it does anything special, and it really ends up feeling just bland and vapid. I mean, there's nothing going on here with the filmic elements. I think there's a few strangling bits of things that I can compliment the film on, but on the whole, it's just Hamlet, and because of that, it just kind of feels lazy. This is just the Academy patting themselves on the back and saying, "Hey, we did a straight version of Hamlet. Isn't that awesome? We love Shakespeare." And I don't think it has any merit of being a Best Picture because it does nothing with film and it does nothing unique on top of Hamlet.
Okay, well, Tanner, what do you think about this film as we cross over the halfway point of our opening remarks?
I think it's when I sat down, I flipped on this film on the old Criterion streaming service. I knew what I was getting myself into. It was a 2.5-hour 1948 version of Hamlet. I didn't expect anything grandiose. I didn't expect anything wildly different, and I got exactly what I expected. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't necessarily let down. This is just, from my understanding, like a cut down version of the Hamlet story. And like Tucker said, I think there's a handful of good things that I can say about this film, but it just didn't blow me away, and I didn't hate it. So it's pretty lukewarm opinions coming from this side, this corner.
I find myself somewhere in between Tanner, you, and Abram. I didn't have great expectations going into this. I was like, oh boy, here we go, Hamlet. But I was pleasantly surprised at some aspects and, undisturbed by other aspects, basically. I think Abram's point about the dialogue moving extremely quickly and it being just Shakespearean writing, it's the lines from the original play, mean that at times it's impossible to tell what's going on. Yes. And so, but at other times I felt myself, I don't know, I challenged myself. I was watching, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try to pay attention and try to get what's happening while we're moving so quickly. Just because, I guess, the film put me in that mood. And for the most part, I was able to get, here and there, some of the funny turns of phrase and whatever that Shakespeare is known for using. They come across, and occasionally they get a laugh on screen, but most of the time I felt like they didn't get a laugh, even when they were a little bit funny. So, I'm not offended by this film. I didn't really like it that much, but, it's pretty stock standard Hamlet retelling. I mean, that's what it is.
The one thing that I do want to say about you and Abram commenting that the dialogue moves very fast, and that is definitely true. They're cramming in as much Shakespeare as they can, as much Hamlet as they can into this cut down version of Hamlet. But I think the crazy part about all of this is it's a juxtaposition between that, it moving so quickly and being very hard to follow because it's, for the most part, language we don't use nowadays. It's very inaccessible from that perspective. But also, Shakespeare likes to write his sentences very long, very verbose, lots of phrases and words that don't necessarily need to be in there to communicate what's going on. And because of that, that means most sequences, even if it's just a basic communication between two characters, can go on for a very long time. And that really kills the pacing. In this movie, not very many things happen. This movie could have been the first half of the plot of another movie. But because characters take such a long time to say what's on their mind, you don't get a lot of things going on. And I found myself confused and frustrated by the inaccessibility of the quick-paced dialogue and the fact that they were using words I'd literally never heard before in my entire life, even though I read Hamlet in high school, and that just shows how I wasn't paying attention. But on top of that, I was just like, wow, it's just moving so slowly, and it does not need to be this long. It feels so drawn out.
I think my problem is that Shakespeare is about his dialogue, and that's why his plays were compelling, and that's why they are so, in my opinion, I hate to say it, but engaging and interesting to read page for page and get extract all of this nuance out of them. But my issue with a lot of the performances here and the way that these sequences are delivered is that it feels somewhere between purposely overacted and melodramatic stage acting and a more serious dramatic approach to these sequences. And I think where a lot of these exchanges land is somewhere in the middle where you get neither, where you can't really believe the emotion of the people acting, but you also can't quite connect to the sort of theatrical element that you would have gotten from a live stage performance in the first place. So because of that, I didn't quite feel the weight of these very iconic exchanges, not only in the context of Shakespeare, but just in literature in general, which I found somewhat disappointing. But what I would say is that I think that the production design and the sets do a lot of heavy lifting to immerse you where the dialogue and the performances didn't for me. I think that the realization of the castle of Denmark was very impressive, and I did enjoy speaking to minor cinematic elements, the way that the camera would sometimes pan across a corridor and you get really interesting long and short shots, the fun little wow transition when Sir Hamlet would appear. I think these things punch up the sort of muddled presentation of a lot of the dialogue for me.
I think, Abram, your point about it straddling in between these two the theatrical realm and the filmic realm are especially prescient because to me, I like the cinematography in this. I actually really like how this film is shot. It's this blend of we have a proscenium arch and the characters are there in front of us acting the stuff out, but we're also a very active camera. The camera moves a lot in this film and it uses very long takes, which to me, signal that, we're trying to highlight these performances, whether or not they land. But we're trying to show off the acting of these characters because that's what this is. It's Shakespeare. We're supposed to act. We're supposed to have all this stuff. And so the camera is there moving around, being dynamic enough to be interesting. I found the camera work, part of my pleasantly surprised element of this film. And I like the transitions. I felt that the way the film, the shooting of the film builds the set. The castle, you can see where rooms connect to each other and we often flow between them in the transitions between scenes. I thought we don't really see that in films. Oftentimes we cut, by the end of the scene, we're into the next location and you don't see them connecting. But they took the time to show you how we connect to these places, as well as, moving around as the characters were speaking, and to me added interest to it. While I'm trying to figure out what's happening with the dialogue, I'm also like, oh, this is a nice shot. And there were some very pretty shots in this film. I found a couple of the night scenes, especially with Hamlet Sr.'s ghost, to be very visually striking. On occasion, there was a nice shot where I said to myself, wow, that's a good shot.
Yeah. I mean, same here, Timo. Throughout the film, I'd be like, oh, that's a cool shot. I especially like the one you brought up, King Hamlet's ghost, where Prince Hamlet is, kneeling before him, and he's sort of, he's blocking off the lower half of King Hamlet's ghost, and there's that heavy fog that's just kind of sitting and rolling. It's not really rising or falling; it's sort of rolling in on itself. I thought that was a great shot, sequence of events. This film, the camera movement was also apparently inspired by Citizen Kane. So this is the Citizen Kane of Shakespeare adaptations. And to you guys' note about the dialogue and how it's Shakespearean and that comes with what it may.
Believe it or not.
A bit of trivia about this. They wanted to sort of update this for modern audiences, believe it or not. So they actually did modernize quite a few turns of phrase. Laurence Olivier and the the person who adapted it, his name was, oh boy, I have it here. Alan Dent. He's the man who sacrilege Shakespeare and changed some of the lines for this movie.
That's actually a point I wanted to raise, because when you watch Branagh adapt Shakespeare, and you can literally follow along in your text as they're doing the exact same things, for a lot of his films, I think that it's good that they took a scalpel to Hamlet in this respect, not only in dialogue in some regards, but Shakespeare has a habit, and real Shakespeare fans are really indoctrinated to thinking that everything he does is brilliant. But he takes a lot of unnecessary digressions in his texts all the time. And the fact that this film, even though it is in my opinion, cumbersome 2.5 hours in length, cuts out some of the you see a little bit of Hamlet seafaring, but you don't get a lot of it, and other things like that.
There's
are
no
removed, and
Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Those characters
Yeah.
are
Yes.
absent
Yeah.
from the film entirely. There's a subplot towards the end where the nation of Denmark is being invaded, and that adds
That's not shown almost at all.
not in there. and frankly, I'm with Abram. I'm okay with it not being in there because it cuts down on the length and the runtime, and it's not strictly necessary to understand Hamlet's character arc and his struggle and his eventual tragedy.
The one thing I would say about it is good that this was not a 6-hour movie. I think the fact that they took things out probably led to a better overall experience, considering it wasn't super long. It was still probably longer than it needed to be in my opinion, but unfortunately I think what that does take away from the film is, in my opinion, one of the biggest knocks against it: variety. Almost every single scene takes place in a very similar location. They're all similar, very similar tonally. They're all using the same small cast of characters. Everything looks the same. The shots are occasionally mixed up, but it felt so samey near the end that I really started, okay, well, have I seen this before? Okay, all these characters are dressed the same and kind of act the same, so do I really remember what this guy's relationship to this guy is? And on the point of the sets, I do think that you're right that it is cool that they built a castle that is interconnected and all of that, but unfortunately, the castle is really only highlighted by the cinematography and the lighting, which I think are both good, and those are some of the things that I would compliment this film on. Unfortunately, I don't think the sets themselves are actually that interesting. I found myself a lot of the time in a film that is focused on static shots and characters having dialogue between one another. You have at least very intricate, very well-designed sets that are laid out beautifully in the background, but for the vast majority of scenes in this film, it is just stone in the background. The rooms are essentially all interchangeable. This is the room where we keep the chair. A chair, okay? This is not a realized place. This is not a place where people live. This is not reflective of the ornate, literal royalty of an entire kingdom. Why aren't there more things on the walls? Why don't they have, like, torches or anything? It's just stone backdrops. And I found that to be really underwhelming and contributed very, very, very much so to the feeling of sameness, of lack of variety. It was very, very frustrating to me that everything looked the same. And when you cut out something like Hamlet seafaring, that of course is not necessary to the core plot, but could offer tonal variety, visual variety, a new location, some new sort of environment for a character to have his personality clash against to get him more well-rounded, they just cut all that out and they dangle it in front of you like, oh, little characteristic, oh yeah, this happens, but we're not going to show it to you. And that was really, really frustrating. It was just...
Now, Tucker, I agree with you. I agree with a lot of points you made there, but unfortunately, the Academy voters in 1948 did not, as this film did win Best Set Direction for a black and white film. I'll just go through the rest of the wins and noms here. Laurence Olivier won Best Actor in a Leading Role. Obviously, this won Best Picture, as well as Best Costume Design. It was also nominated for Best Actress in a Supporting Role. Gene Simmons, and not the Kiss guitarist Gene Simmons, but I believe she's the one who portrayed Ophelia.
Yes.
Okay.
And Laurence Olivier was also nominated for Best Director, and the score was also nominated. Laurence Olivier, by the way, became the first person to ever direct himself into a Best Actor win.
Very interesting. As we've talked about earlier in previous episodes, not always a good combination to direct yourself. But Lauren, I feel like he did a pretty okay job. You brought up the costumes there, and I just want to throw in a little caveat. If I were an Academy voter, I would probably agree that the film has good costumes if we only look from the waist up. I know what you mean. Okay, here we go. They have very intricate suits, and they have nice hats and the crowns and the makeup and the hair is all very good. And then they're just wearing tights and boring shoes underneath with gigantic crotch bulges. I don't really want to see that when I'm watching.
It's Shakespearean. Come on, Timo. If you're not looking at a British man's giant bulge, you're not watching Shakespeare, my friend.
Are you really experiencing the true wonder?
I guess you are right about that. But yeah, so I think overall it only won 4 things, so it's not very many compared to some of these other films that we've seen. But it's okay, I guess.
Although, speaking of British men, this also is technically the first foreign film to win Best Picture, as it was the first non-American. It was a British film. So yes, the first foreign Best Picture and the first British film to win Best Picture as well.
Real quickly, I just want to head back to what Tucker said about the sets, and I agree that it's pretty looks like everything looks the same in the background. But remember that these plays were written for. I'm just explaining. I don't think this is a defense of the film, but the plays were written to be in a single stage where they don't have a lot of time and opportunity to change around sets. And so when you take like Shakespeare writes like 0 stage directions or like how things look, and so it's all up to the interpretation of who designed it. So the fact that they were able, you could perform Hamlet in a black room and just have the bare minimum sets, and it would probably still come off because it's not really about the location; it's about the character. And while we don't really get that much variety in locations in the film, I don't necessarily blame the filmmakers for that.
Yeah.
I mean, the only reason I would say I do is because they are doing it so one-to-one for the dialogue that not taking any liberties with anything else in the backgrounds, you have nothing to look at. There's no texture to it. There's no place, and it makes the whole thing feel really, really empty. So I would say I see that as a pretty big criticism because they have the opportunity to making a film adaptation of it to add something more to it visually, and they really didn't. Especially for Best Picture winner. I mean, come on, guys. We're comparing this to Ben-Hur and Last Emperor and these gorgeous sets that we praised lavishly, and this is one that's just dialogue. Why can't there also be great sets?
Even because to be fair, those came out after, and film became more budget heavy after 1948. But even comparing it to The Great Ziegfeld, which came out before this film, had much more lavish sets, obviously because of the setting. But I think, Tucker, you bring up a salient point that's they did something a little experimental with the camera work in this. Like I said, inspired by Citizen Kane. But the empty sets are in the interchangeable nature of all these sets is a solid detriment to the film.
Yeah, I mean, when Ophelia is gallivanting around and eventually kills herself, when we're outside, it's a nice breather.
Oh, it's so nice to finally see something other than fucking stone walls. Oh, God.
I will say that does raise another issue I have with the film where I don't really feel like the filmmakers aptly captured the theme of madness, which is pretty integral to Hamlet. Yeah. Whether in Hamlet himself or in Ophelia, I don't think that this... Again, I think it captures the broad strokes of the narrative, and of course it's trimmed and changed. But even, the to be or not to be sequence, a lot of these things that contribute a lot to theme felt underserved to me. And even Ophelia's suicide in the river didn't quite hammer home what I wanted it to. I don't think that, again... Yeah, the sets of Shakespeare are never the focus because it's the characters, it's the dialogue, it's the theme. But I'm not sure the characters, the dialogue, the theme are what gets captured in the stead of sets. Again, I'm a little bit more positive on them than you are, but I think that the eye is more easily drawn to that emptiness when there's not a vacuum. You're not vacuum sucked into the performances of the characters, because I don't think that they're communicating in a way that captures the richness of the themes that Shakespeare wrote into his texts.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Timo.
I was just going to add on to that I definitely felt like in a reading of Hamlet, I get this idea is Hamlet mad, or is he actually just acting to get what he wants in this circumstance? And this, it's very unclear. It's very everyone thinks he's mad, but he doesn't really look that mad to me. And so it's that I think that theme definitely is, if not underserved, almost non-existent.
Laurence Olivier, as classically trained as he is, I don't think he can effectively capture that, that unhinged nature of Hamlet. But he is a solid actor. I think probably the best performance piece of the film is when he's berating his mother for leaving his father behind so quickly. That is probably the emotional acting high point of the film. And that was where I was, again, most engrossed in it. I wasn't paying attention to, the emptiness of the sets or even the camera work at that point. That's the point where I was, like Abram said, vacuum sealed into Laurence Olivier's performance.
I do
Yeah.
think, though, there is something to be said for how camera work that is present in some instances of the film could have punched up the theme a little bit more. There's already a distortion when Hamlet Sr. arrives, and that kind of telegraphed to me that we're going to get maybe some more of this sort of camera work that communicates maybe things aren't as they are, because we do get, you know, the soliloquies we get from characters that are usually asides in Shakespeare to kind of communicate internal thought are just told as sort of like an external thought from these characters. So I figured if we're already going to be kind of melding into the intellectual, into the spiritual a little bit, both in terms of how dialogue is presented and in terms of how some camera moves happen, I would have wanted to see more of that. Maybe some more close-ups on a Laurence Olivier, maybe doing like a ooh face or a little bit of is he going nuts? What's going on here? Like an Anthony Perkins Psycho close-up, something like that. I think would have maybe added some more layers to that nuance, but I just didn't really see that, which was disappointing.
The one moment
Yeah,
where
I mean-
that did pull out for me is in that bedroom scene with Hamlet's mother, and we get almost a shift in POV in the same where we POV over Hamlet's shoulder to see the ghost, and then the camera dollies over the shoulder of his mom, and she doesn't see the ghost. And little special effects there, and in that scene, I thought, oh. Weird. Is that ghost really there, or is it just because Hamlet's seeing it there? And that was the one moment where I went back and I questioned all of Hamlet's actions. Oh, he's doing this because the ghost told him to, but did he really see the ghost? That's
Yeah.
what that shot communicated to me, and that was one of my favorite shots in the film. There's probably one other that is most remarkable in my mind, but when we're trying to communicate that kind of stuff, the film could be more obvious, I think. I think the film could, like you said, amp it up and you go in closer, move around a little bit, maybe cut a little bit more. Even though I like the longer takes, you are allowed to edit in a movie.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now I have a question for you guys. Do you think in this I'm baiting you into a piece of trivia here, so just to give you a heads up. Do you think there is a sort of higher artistic reason for the black and white cinematography of this film?
I don't know, Tanner. Is there?
No, there's not. Even though Laurence Olivier said that at the time that there was, he later admitted it was only in black and white because I was in the middle of a furious row with Technicolor. I don't know what a row is, but I think
A row. It's a word for
row.
a fight.
Yeah, there was
Okay,
some
well, there
beef
you go.
between Laurence Olivier and Technicolor. I was going to guess it is because he didn't have the money to pay for color film because it's more expensive, but that's an even greater reason. I love that reason way more
He
than
was
that
like,
he just
nah,
did.
those guys pissed me off.
I fucking hate Technicolor. We're not using that. That's foolish. That's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Speaking of fights, should we talk about the tragic ending
Oh, yes.
of the film?
Let's do it.
Of course.
Because I was both impressed and underwhelmed by it.
Sure.
I think that there's a great physical element to the dueling. I think it's actually pretty stunning the way that they're clashing for points there. But my problem is that this is where I want that Shakespeare overacting. I want someone to get stabbed and to throw their arms up in the air and completely lose themselves because they've been poisoned. The queen is poisoned and she just kind of fades away. I think this sequence is emblematic of where I missed the theatrical element that sells the emotion and the bombast with which Shakespeare intentionally has a tragedy like this end. I found myself mesmerized by the sword fighting, but then not convinced by how we were playing off the fact that, oh my God, Hamlet's about to die because he got poisoned, the other guy's poisoned, the mom's poisoned, everybody's poisoned. But I don't think we found that overacting resonance that I think we probably needed to sell something of that magnitude.
In the 1996 version of this film, I think that does a very good job in this ending scene. It, like, people are like swinging off chandeliers and like things are flying and there's like guns getting shot. It's madness. And this film is a lot more toned down and the swords clash. And while the sword choreography is cool and it works, I can't see the poison on the end of the tip. And the like blood makeup special effects is not very good. And so it doesn't add to that very melodramatic, what I want from this tragic end that I know is coming the entire film. Everybody knows how Hamlet ends. And so why not just totally go crazy and amp it up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the sequences in this film that are intended to be like, oh, it's Hamlet, we know it's like a crazy emotional moment, didn't really hit, not only because that acting is in such a weird place, like everyone was saying, where you can't tell if they're supposed to be super serious or like they're gonna be a little more dramatic. I found myself genuinely laughing at a few sequences that were supposed to be emotional because there would be a weird narration going. Like it's the scene where Hamlet and Ophelia, he's like caressing his face and like doing some weird shit. He's like narrating himself, or she's narrating himself doing it, and like, but it's like slightly off sync. So like it's a really weird way for like this guy to be doing these gestures that don't really apply to like a human situation, and then he goes straight back to being serious. And you're like, oh, okay, well, is this supposed to be like emotionally wrenching, or just are we supposed to feel this way because we know how Hamlet goes and not because of anything the film is doing or the actors? I have a lot to say about this film and why, in my opinion, it is not the worst film that we've seen, but it is by far and away my least favorite. I have it at the bottom of every Best Picture winner we've ever seen. Not only because of my disconnect from Shakespeare, which I have yet to fully go into here, but because it does all the things that we compliment Best Pictures on for doing so well. I really feel it does things poorly. It doesn't particularly use the art of filmmaking to enhance its story. It doesn't have an incredibly rich cast of characters for us to connect to in any particular way because they're not given enough time to breathe. It's certainly, very obviously, written for the in-group of people who know Shakespeare. It's not accessible to the wider audience. It does nothing to increase engagement with its visuals or its sets or its writing or whatever. And at the end of the day, I really think that this is the most boring film we've watched from every technical perspective. And because it's just Hamlet being retold, it also feels like the laziest. These people didn't put in it doesn't feel like there was any effort put in to make this the ultimate film version of Hamlet. It's just a film version of Hamlet. And that's why it boggles my mind that this won Best Picture. Compared against such things that are the epitome of what filmmaking should be, this does nothing for filmmaking. If this hadn't existed, it wouldn't have. This doesn't impact film history in the slightest. It's just Hamlet.
I do have to push back against that a little bit because I agree with some of your sentiments, but in my opinion, I think they're a little bit too harsh. I think that there is quite the art in being able to translate this timeless story to a cohesive cinematic narrative. And I think that the use of some really great deep focus shots, and I always think probably my favorite shot in the film is when Citizen Kane deep focus shots, put that in your notebook as I did in my intro to film class, where you got Hamlet in the foreground and all the way in the background you see Ophelia. I think things like this are subtle but very important to creating I would say like 1 to 1.5 version. They're of course not at parity, but I think that the ability to create this subtle but holistic telling of the story with performances that are impassioned, even if I don't feel like they hit what I want out of Shakespeare, there is merit to that. And I do think that there was effort put in here. I don't think that this was a low effort film. And there's a big difference between a performance of Shakespeare as a play and as a film. And I can talk about wanting it punched up more, but I think what is here is compelling. Whether it's as compelling as the other Best Pictures, I would say obviously not. I have it a lot further down personally, but I do think that there is technique here, and there is a love for the craftsmanship of both theater and cinema here that I think you're underselling a little bit.
When you spend a lot of time, when you make movies, you realize that moving shots in any capacity, any movement of the camera means that you have to, your shooting time goes up by like 3-4 times. It's so hard to shoot stuff with camera moves and characters and it's synced with their acting. Like that is, it's effort. It's so much easier to lock your camera down, have it not move whatsoever, and shoot scenes, punch in for close-ups. That's in my mind, that's what lazy filmmaking is. And the lighting, the cinematography, the costumes, the sets, even if they're not very visually interesting, they're big. They probably weren't cheap. And so while I think there's a lot of issues with this film, it's certainly not a lazy movie at all. I've got some of the other films that came out in 1948 just so we can compare here. There's not that many that are really well known. Besides from Alfred Hitchcock's Rope came out this year. We got The Red Shoes, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and then probably my favorite from this year is Bicycle Thief, which is a very good movie. But
a
that
great
was
film.
that was an Italian film, so it probably did not even cross the Academy voters' mind that it could win.
Hey,
I believe
this is the
Drunken Angel
first.
also this year.
This was the first foreign film. Why can't they nominate Italian films? Come on, Academy.
Come
from
on,
1948.
Academy. Yeah.
No, Bicycle Thieves is the antithesis of Shakespeare. It's got poor people.
Oh, yeah.
And it's about common themes of struggle and economics. It's
they're
not about.
they're
It's not
grounded.
highfalutin enough.
Yeah, it's grounded
Yes.
human emotions rather than dramatized theatrics. But Tucker, I feel we're winding down here, fellas. So I saved my favorite piece of trivia for last. And Tucker, you aren't alone in disliking this adaptation of Hamlet, though. Yeah, I'm not sure you would agree with these people entirely either. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as Shakespeare purists of the time also did not like this film. One Shakespeare purist was named Ethel Barrymore, the sister of famed actor and recurring
Drew Barrymore.
yeah, no, well, kind of. John Barrymore is her brother. Funny enough, she said that this version wasn't as good as the 1922 Broadway version, in which John Barrymore played Hamlet. So take that with a grain of salt. She was also the presenter at that year's Oscars for the Best Picture award, and was
that's
apparently
hilarious.
visually shaken when she read out Laurence Olivier's name, because he was a producer on the film, so he was awarded the Best Picture statuette. But
he was double fisting when he walked home that night.
well, no, because to add a final twist to the proverbial dagger, Laurence Olivier was not in attendance that night, as the true Shakespearean actor that he is. He was performing a play in London with his wife.
Okay. Very, very highfalutin. Excellent piece of trivia to round us up here. We've gone on a bunch, so I'm very curious to see what all scores get punched in. I've got my number ready here, ready to go. I've typed it in.
Sure.
Quick, ready? Are you guys ready? We're going to reveal this
ready.
in 3 and 2 and 1. Boom. I put mine in. And we're pretty close here on this. It's actually very, I'm kind of astonished. I thought there was going to be a much greater swing in this voting, but not to keep you in suspense any longer, the score that 1948 and Laurence Olivier's Hamlet gets is a straight 5.0. That's what the average rounds out to be. So no ties here. It's just gonna slot in right in between Out of Africa and From Here to Eternity. Gonna go above that film. And so the point breakdown, starting at the bottom, Tucker gave it a 4.2 out of 10. I gave it a 4.5. Tanner gave it a 5.3, and Abram gave it a 6.1. So not a huge swing of points, but right there in the middle. I think the phrase "I didn't hate it" is pretty much how I sum up my experience of this film.
Yeah, I think that is common amongst all. Well,
maybe not all of us.
Maybe
but.
for most of us.
No, well, I'm finally gonna to let it loose.
Okay.
This is probably one of my least favorite movies I've ever seen in my entire life. I give it the points that it has because I begrudgingly know that Hamlet is a story that people like. I respect the artistry and the cinematography and the lighting and the costume design, which I think are all solid, but it does none of what I think is important, not only in storytelling, but in filmmaking, and I feel it is one of the weakest Best Pictures we've seen because of that. I mentioned a lot of problems earlier, but I think I didn't give enough weight and credence to the fact that the inaccessibility of Shakespeare's dialogue not being particularly modernized for our audience this many years later, being high school students who studied it in high school, or college students who studied in high school, excuse me, we're not that young, but especially for the time, this was a movie for the in-group, for the ultra giga-brained elite to say, hey, look, we did Shakespeare and we loved it. I felt like a person who doesn't speak English listening to English being spoken. I was so confused for so much of this movie because it's so ridiculous that people see fucking 600-year-old dialogue and they're like, oh, look, it's great. Oh, he's using words we don't know. Yeah, but he's also using words we don't know. If you make a movie which most of the words aren't words that people use in real life, It doesn't communicate emotion. It doesn't communicate what the characters are thinking. So there's no way to connect to their deeper personal desires or interpersonal relationships or anything. I found myself disconnected from the characters, from the world they were in because it wasn't well realized, disappointed in the cinematography because it didn't do anything more, disappointed in the adaptation because it was just straight dialogue from the play. Every aspect of this film frustrated to me to my very core as a film watcher. This is far and away my least favorite Best Picture winner, and I believe it'll probably end up staying there. I think this movie really fucking sucks.
Okay. Well, Tucker, to balance the scales with a bit of an explanation, and we addressed this in our review, is that while your criticisms of the dialogue may or may not be salient, I think that is the reason we have, the well-known trope and, school of Shakespearean acting, where you overact, you overemphasize emotions. And while that wasn't, present in this film all of the time, I think that is why that school of acting matters, is to, overcome that flowery language that Shakespeare used to communicate to the audience the emotions. Despite the fact that, people also, it takes a little effort maybe to understand Shakespearean dialogue, but people can do it, and people have done it.
I just want to bring up Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet as a straight dialogue adaptation, but a very different from production design of Shakespeare. That movie is very understandable, but it's all because of all these other filmic elements. That's, I think there's some issues with that film. But as you go with taking dialogue directly from Shakespeare, if you're gonna do Shakespeare, I feel like, the thing about Shakespeare is the writing, and so and the writing was the dialogue. He didn't write anything else, and so to use that at least in some regard is appropriate. And he is a fairly important historical figure for the English language, and so it's at least respectful to try to use some of his original writing in the script, even when you change it here and there for things. There are words that have completely shifted in meaning too. The words were not written as, he used one word and it changed, and we now think of it in a different way. I think prophet stuck out in my mind as one of them in this film. It's not used in the same way as it was when it was originally written, and so I guess that's just the deal with Shakespeare. But
What's the deal with Shakespeare?
Now, if I could add my 2 cents to as the highest score given
please.
today.
Yeah, please.
At a stunning 6.1 out of 10.
Really, a standing ovation of a score.
Yes. And to try to not delve too deep into just defending Shakespeare, because that's a non sequitur, unfortunately, to a certain extent, it's important to note, of course, Shakespeare was written for the common person, which is kind of an interesting way to look at how language has changed as it is. But I think that part of why Shakespeare is compelling is unlocking what he's saying and kind of tracking that alongside the way we have changed, the way we speak and communicate. So I think that Shakespeare is a really interesting capsule into our history, and from a literary sense and from a linguistic sense. And the merit I find in a one-to-one adaptation like this, or one-to-one as I'd put in quotes, is the fact that Shakespeare is inherently better understood through film or through theater. I think there's a reason why after you read the text in all of your English classes, you watch an adaptation afterwards. And I think that if you're watching this removed from the context of experience with the text, you're going to understand the broad strokes, because even though I have issues with the delivery, I think that the passion with which these actors do deliver the lines shows that they cared to sort of ingest this material and present it in a way where you can understand who has betrayed who and the strokes of the narrative, and then there's something more to dig into. And as I said before, I do think that this is punched up a little bit. I think Timo, a great your point about movement is really important, and I think the ways that we were able to make this character study flow instead of being broken up scene for scene is very interesting. The use of deep focus, the use of pretty cohesive sets and little interesting touches like the distortion for Hamlet Senior, all of these things add up to what I feel is a more approachable manner to get into Hamlet. I don't think it is. I think it is far from the optimal one, but I think its ability to translate this story is important, and I think it is timeless. I think there's a reason that it's in the Criterion Collection, that it did win beyond just being a film that just so happened to catch the attention of the audience and the Academy back then. But again, I did have trouble with the way that we straddled the emotional and overacting elements, and I had some issues with the ways that theme was underplayed. So while I think it's a solid film and I enjoyed it, it is far from my favorite adaptation of a Shakespeare play.
There we
I
go.
think one thing I'm going to finally close with on this, and maybe this spins into a larger conversation, but the fact that we didn't mention once this entire review any of the characters in the film and their arcs or their personalities or their relationships in any particular way. The movies that we've connected most to in this entire series are the ones where we know either a large cast of characters or really get to know one particular character and can name all of their personality quirks and the things that they dream for and want for and dislike. And instead, we focus on every other element of this film. And I think because just the characters are obviously, yes, the stereotypes, this is where the stereotypes and tropes came from, but they're very, very bland because of that. It does nothing to interest you, to subvert your expectations. It's just stock standard everything, bland as fuck. And I can't say that I remember any particular character moment from this movie other than the fact that, yeah, it's Hamlet. And Hamlet's been done 40 gazillion times in significantly better ways, more interesting from every possible perspective. And this does nothing to alleviate those issues of it being the bare fucking minimum. I do think that this film did feel lazy because of that.
I do want to say, I want to pull back the proverbial quest curtain. We do have a time pressure here, so I'm going to say this very briefly, but I think in Quest over Time, to be fair, I don't think we talked about the narrative and the characters because the narrative and characters of Hamlet are established. I think what's interesting to discuss in an adaptation of Shakespeare is the ways in which it was adapted. Because we could have had a conversation of an equal or greater length in which I defended that plot and those characters because I think that there is nuance there that is interesting, and the ways that Shakespeare is able to establish these evergreen archetypes is very compelling. And I think that the struggle of Hamlet Jr. is interesting, and there's sort of a political and familial and even a little bit of a sexual intrigue there that remains compelling today. I don't think I scored it purely because of the adaptation. I scored it because there's a great base under here. Just to be fair, just to give the other side before we wrap up the episode.
Watch Lion King instead.
If you want to get into Hamlet, well, it's an adaptation of sorts.
It is. It's the same basic broad strokes of story.
Well, we didn't answer my question about whether we would to quest or not to quest today, but maybe we'll have to put that off for another.
The quest. We're going to continue to quest sans Shakespeare. We have eliminated Shakespeare from our pool of movies to pick from now.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah, and now I think we need to figure out from that remaining pool minus Shakespeare what it is we're watching next week. So I've got that spin wheel pulled up, and Tanner, are you ready to? Can you come up with a Shakespearean rhyme on the spot?
I will not.
Just add F to the end. Wheeleth, what's your dealeth?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, and there it is. Are you guys ready? Tanner, 3, 2, 1.
Wheeleth, what's your dealeth? Give us a movie that makes us squealeth. Is it on digital or is it on real? Wheel, what is your dealeth?
That made me crack up way more than it had any right to. But you can see that number. It's number 12. So, Mr. Tucker.
Another new one.
A newish one, probably in the last couple years. Let's see what film this is. You got it ready, Tucker?
This number 12 brings us to, I'm going to say it, probably the most infamous Best Picture winner of all time. It takes us back to ye old year of 2004 when we were in our pull-up shit in our pants. And we're going to be talking about a movie starring Don Cheadle, Michael Pena, Sandra Bullock, Brendan Fraser, Terrence Howard, Ludacris. Directed by Paul Haggis. We will be watching Crash.
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 Tucker, you are correct. The most infamously, apparently bad Best Picture winner I've never seen. I assume you fellas have never seen.
I don't think any of us have. You've seen Crash?
Never seen Crash. Never seen it.
Is this the first one that none of us have seen?
Your Honor.
Maybe. No, there's
no way.
Okay, that can't be true. But
Great Ziegfeld comes to mind.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
I watched Out of Africa 6 times, actually. When I was a child.
Well, at least it's not a very long movie. It's a little under 2 hours, so there we go. Who knows what we're going to talk about? I have I don't really know much about Crash, to be honest. People say it to me in passing, and it goes in one ear and out the other.
Yeah. We may have poisoned the well, saying it's infamously bad, but it is. So we'll see.
Well, you guys, you Quest listeners, you beautiful people out there, we'll hear and watch next week when we talk about Crash by Paul Haggis. Hope you join us. Hope you enjoyed this Shakespearean discussion. And, well, we'll catch you then. Peace.
This man's last name is Haggis.
Is it a little mean that I get a lot of joy out of Tucker being very pained by watching Hamlet?
It was an interesting experience. I don't know how many stories we have time to tell, but there are stories to tell.
I fell asleep during it. I'm gonna be honest with you.
I passed out last night while I was watching it. Yeah. Anything? All right, you ready to go? I'm ready to go. Let's go. Let's talk about.
I'm ready.
Hamlet doesn't give a shit. That's what I've discovered in this movie. Okay. Hey, everyone.